you're still listening to boring tales. If your eyes are closed, and your breath is soft, we'll simply continue. Lucus is still at work. Slow and steady. Marking lines, reviewing old patterns, tracing memories into clay. Nothing has changed. Nothing needs to. Let's drift gently back into the next quiet part of his day. The air in the workshop was still. The scrolls had been returned. The pattern was traced. And now, it was time to mix. Lucas walked toward the back wall, past the tracing slab, past the shelf of chalks and tiles, to where two wide clay basins sat, nestled into a stone recess, each one stained with the memory of many, many mixtures. One held lime. The other, clean water. Not rushing water. Not cold. Just still. Lucas paused before them. He rolled up his sleeves, slowly, until the fabric rested gently above his elbows. Then he reached for the worn wooden scoop, its handle smooth with age, and dipped it into the lime. The powder was soft. Fine. Like sifted flour. It billowed slightly as he moved, rising in a pale cloud before settling again. As if it had never been disturbed. He tipped the scoop into a wide mixing bowl, watching the powder mound and settle. And then, again. Scoop. Pour. Scoop. Pour. Until a soft pile had formed, white and silent. Next came the water. He dipped the ladle, a round bowl carved from dark wood, into the basin beside him, and lifted it carefully. The water caught the light. It shimmered gently, as if uncertain whether to be seen. He poured it in a slow stream. Over the powdered lime. Watching as the surface hissed, just slightly, then quieted. Another ladle. Then another. The bowl was now ready. Lucas reached for the mixing stick, a long rod of olive wood, notched and stained from years of turning. He placed it into the center of the bowl, pressed his hand gently against the rim, and began to stir. Slowly. Clockwise. One circle. Then two. The lime resisted at first, clinging to the bowl, to itself, but gradually softened, absorbing the water bit by bit, until it became a thick, chalky paste. Lucas stirred for a long while. There was no rush. This was not a task to finish. Only one to do. The scent was sharp, but not unpleasant, a mix of stone dust and water, earth and lime. Something ancient, like the scent of a dry riverbed after the first rain. He stopped, lifted the stick, watched the mortar drip slowly from the end in slow, heavy drops. Then stirred again. Each turn of the stick was a breath. A rhythm. A soft repetition that echoed the silence of the room. Eventually, the mortar reached the right consistency, not too thin, not too thick. It held its shape, but moved when asked. Like wet earth. Half asleep. Lucas set the stick aside. Wiped his hands slowly on the cloth hanging from his belt. And let the bowl sit. The mortar needed to rest. To breathe. To come into itself. Lucas, too, needed a moment. He sat beside it. On the small wooden stool near the wall. He didn't close his eyes, but he let them drift. To the traced pattern on the slab. To the stack of tiles waiting in their baskets. To the morning light. Now warmer. Falling through the shuttered window in soft golden bands. The mortar would be ready soon. And then, stone by stone, the mosaic would begin. The mixing was done. The bowl sat full. Heavy with chalky paste. Quiet. Still. Lucas didn't move. He remained seated beside it, his hands resting loosely in his lap, his eyes on the mortar, though he wasn't really watching. He was listening. Not to sound. But to stillness. The mortar needed to settle. The lime. To dissolve completely. The mixture. To cool and rest. He knew the process. He had done it hundreds of times. But he never hurried it. To lay mosaic well. The preparation must be patient. He leaned slightly forward, trailing one finger along the rim of the bowl. It left a pale line of dust behind. A tiny arc of white. He smiled. The surface of the mortar had begun to change, subtle ripples vanishing, air bubbles rising then disappearing with soft, soundless bursts. Lucus reached for the cloth again, folded it in half, and placed it gently over the bowl. Not to hide it. Only to shelter it. Like shading a flame. Or closing a curtain just enough to soften the light. He stood. Stretched his arms behind him in slow arcs. Not to loosen. Only to move. Then, he crossed the room to the corner where a shallow stone basin waited, filled with small tiles soaking in clean water. Not for washing. For calming. The tiles, cut from marble, terracotta, and limestone, rested beneath the surface, cool and quiet. They had been soaking since yesterday. Now, they were soft around the edges. Not to touch, but to place. Lucus trailed his fingers across the water's top, sending soft ripples outward. The tiles shifted just slightly. As if waking from a dream. He didn't lift any of them. Not yet. He returned to the stool. Sat once more. And waited. Outside, a dove cooed, soft, low, barely audible through the thick shuttered window. A breeze stirred the linen curtain, but did not enter. Inside the workshop, time stretched thin, like melted wax. Slow. Warm. Yielding. The mortar needed only minutes more. But Lucus gave it 10. Always 10. Not for science. Not for accuracy. But because in those 10 minutes, he rested too. He watched the light as it crept slowly across the floor. Noticed how the color of the wall deepened in the sun. Thought, briefly, of the mosaic he had laid in the temple of Janus, years ago, and how the mortar that day had been too fast. Too eager. How he'd had to scrape and remix before he could begin. He would not make that mistake today. 10 minutes. Not 5. Not 8. 10. And when those minutes passed, slowly. Gently. Peacefully. Lucus stood, lifted the cloth, and looked again at the bowl. The mortar was ready. It had settled. It had stilled. It had become what it needed to be. Tomorrow, or the next day, it would harden, become stone again. But today, it was soft, yielding, perfect. Just like this moment. The mortar was ready. Lucus stood quietly beside the bowl, letting the truth of it settle in. No need to touch it again. No need to stir. It had arrived. At its stillness. And now, so would he. He moved toward the shallow basin, where the water still rippled gently from the last brush of his fingers. Inside, tiles of stone soaked in silence. Small, square, and waiting. Some white. Some cream. Some with a speck of rust or a gray vein that danced across the surface like ink in water. Lucus knelt beside the basin. His knees rested on the worn mat, the straw beneath it dry and sweet-smelling, like the corners of a granary long forgotten. He let his hands hover just above the water. Not yet touching. Just feeling the stillness. Then, slowly, his fingertips dipped in. Breaking the surface, sinking through the cool. He didn't grab. He didn't search. He let his fingers drift, moving lightly, like seaweed in a tide pool. The stones were not chosen by color alone, nor by shape, but by a quiet knowing. Each one, when touched just right, seemed to say, yes. Me. He picked one. Then another. Each lifted gently from the water and placed onto the drying cloth laid out on the low table beside him. A soft tapping sound as the water dripped off the tile and was caught by the linen. And then again. Pick. Place. Tap. The cloth grew dotted with stone, a slow constellation of calm intention. Lucus did not rush. The edge tiles would set the boundary. Define the frame within which everything else would quietly exist. He liked to begin with the outermost border. Not for precision. But for grounding. Like the edge of a garden. Or the lip of a well. It kept things inside. Protected. Gentle. He lifted a white marble square from beneath the surface, a little larger than the rest. Too large, maybe. But it was smooth. and simple. And its weight in his palm felt balanced. He placed it on a separate cloth. The first edge tile. Then a smaller one, cream-colored, with a tiny fleck of green that seemed to vanish when turned toward the light. Another. And another. He didn't count. He didn't plan. He simply let the stones find their place in his hands. After a time, the table was half covered with quiet selections. Tiles that had been underwater only minutes before now sat in the golden light, their surfaces damp but slowly drying. Taking in the air, becoming ready. Lucus straightened, his knees stiff from kneeling, and stretched slowly, his spine unrolling like a scroll. Then he walked to the basket of dry tiles beside the shelf. He wouldn't use them today. Not yet. But he liked to look. Inside were stones from all over the region, travertine, limestone, slate, pieces chipped from broken columns, others cut from fresh quarry blocks. He ran his hand across the top layer, letting the textures speak. Some rough. Some smooth. Some flat and quiet. Some loud with color and grain. He wouldn't need them yet. But tomorrow. Or the next day. They'd become sky. Or floor. Or flowing river. Today was for the edge. Back at the table, he arranged the damp tiles in a soft row, not exact, just close enough to feel the rhythm. Light beside light. A fleck here. A line there. Nothing loud. Nothing bold. Just stones. Resting beside each other. Waiting. Lucus sat once more. He placed his hand on the edge of the table. Then the other hand beside the first. And breathed. A long, quiet breath that reached down into the belly and rose back up without hurry. He looked at the tiles. At the mortar. At the traced pattern waiting on the slab. Everything was ready. But not today. Today was for preparing. For soaking. For choosing. For mixing and watching and waiting. Tomorrow. He would begin to place. Stone by stone. Line by line. Until the image appeared. But for now. Lucus simply sat, the weight of the day soft on his shoulders, the scent of lime in the air, and the slow comfort of being exactly where he needed to be. Morning arrived. But it did not rush in. It entered slowly, as light through a linen curtain, as warmth across a cold floor, as breath returning after a long sleep. Lucus was already awake. He had risen before the sun, as he always did on days like this. Today, the laying would begin. He stood at the slab, hands clean, robe tied at the waist, his tools placed neatly beside the frame. A wide spatula, flat, dull-edged, not made for slicing, but for smoothing. A narrow blade, curved slightly at the tip, for pressing the mortar into corners. And a short, stiff brush, for clearing away what did not belong. Each tool, familiar. Each one, silent. He reached for the bowl of mortar. It had rested overnight, covered and cool. Now. It was ready. Lucas lifted it carefully, bringing it to the slab, and set it beside the traced design, a pattern of curling lines, drawn in charcoal, faint but clear. Not a full image yet. Just a foundation. Just suggestion. He dipped the spatula into the thick, pale mixture. Lifted it slowly. Watched it stretch, then sag, then fall in a heavy curve onto the stone surface. He did not rush. He did not cover much. Just a small square, the size of 2 palms, maybe 3. The first section was always the smallest. The most careful. The most slow. Lucas spread the mortar with a steady hand, pressing it gently into the traced lines, guiding it into each hollow, each corner, each curve. He smoothed it flat, then roughened it slightly with the back of the spatula. Not rough to the eye. Just enough for the tile to grip. He breathed out. The surface was ready. The first tile would come next. But he waited. He stood there, tools in hand, and let the moment expand. Like steam in a bathhouse. Or oil on water. This quiet space before the first stone, was sacred. He remembered his master, many years ago, speaking softly before his first mosaic. A single tile. Holds the entire mosaic within it, he had said. Lay it with care, and the others will follow. Lucus bent down to the table where the selected stones lay, now dry, their surfaces pale and ready. He reached for the white marble square he had chosen yesterday. The one slightly larger than the rest. Smooth-edged. Plain. True. He lifted it gently. Held it in both hands as if it were fragile. It wasn't. But care was not about fragility. It was about intention. He moved to the slab. Bent low. Placed the tile at the very bottom corner of the design, where the outer border would begin. And pressed. Softly. Firmly. Evenly. The mortar welcomed it, rose slightly at the edges, embraced it like clay around a footprint. Lucus stepped back. Looked at the tile. Then looked again. It sat. Still. Not crooked. Not proud. Just. Right. He breathed again. Then reached for the next. The first stone sat. Quiet and still. Pressed gently into the bed of mortar that held it like a cradle, not with tightness, but with trust. Lucus stood motionless. Watching it. As if waiting to see whether it would shift, or sink, or rise unexpectedly. But it did none of those things. It remained. Just as it had been placed. A square of white. On a pale sea of lime and dust. A beginning. He turned back to the table. Reached for the next tile, a smaller piece, ivory with a hint of yellow near the corner. He held it up to the light. Turned it once. Then again. The surface caught a dull gleam from the early sun. Lucus stepped forward. And placed it beside the first. There was no snapping sound. No dramatic press. Only the soft whisper of stone meeting mortar. And the settling that followed, quiet. Certain. Inevitable. He pressed the surface lightly with his thumb. Checked the height. Made sure the edge was flush with the first. Not too close. Not too wide. Just enough for the line to breathe. Then another. And another. Each one chosen not just for its color or size, but for its feeling. Lucus worked without speaking. Without thinking in words. His mind had shifted into another rhythm, not of logic, but of presence. Each movement was measured. Not in time. But in texture. The mortar thickened slightly as the air warmed. He adjusted his pace. Still slow. Still steady. But responsive. At the edge of the slab, he reached for his small wooden straightedge, a simple tool, worn smooth by years of handling. He laid it gently along the row of stones already set. Checked the alignment. The line was clean. Not perfect. But true. Lucus nodded to himself. Not in approval. But in acknowledgement. Then, he picked up the brush. Not for dust. Not for cleaning. But for listening. He brushed lightly along the row, not sweeping. But touching. The sound it made, soft and brief, told him what he needed to know. Each tile was secure. He dipped his fingers in the bowl for a fresh bit of mortar. Spread a thin layer beside the last stone. Only enough for 2 more tiles. He never laid more than 5 in a row without stepping back. Because 5 was still something he could hold in his mind's eye. More than that, and the line would become a blur of ambition. So he placed one. Then the next. Both with the same slow press. The same quiet breath. Then he stood. Stepped back. Looked. The row now stretched half the width of the slab. A pale, whispering border, barely there, but present. Like the edge of dawn before the sky takes shape. Lucus walked slowly around the slab, looking from different angles, letting the light fall as it would on the stones. He touched none of them. Only observed. And in that observation, he found peace. The first row was laid. He did not celebrate. He did not record it. He only stood beside it. Like a companion who had walked quietly next to something coming into being. Lucus returned to his place beside the slab. The morning sun had climbed just enough to warm the edges of the studio wall, a thin line of light slanting across the floor, catching on flecks of stone dust like sparks in slow motion. He felt the air change, not in temperature, but in presence. The day had begun, but it hadn't hurried. It unfolded, like linen. Creased, then smoothed by gentle hands. He dipped the spatula into the mortar bowl again, lifted the pale mix, and laid another soft patch along the edge of the traced pattern. Not large. Not deep. Just a soft bed, wide enough for a few small tiles, no more. He set the spatula aside. And paused. Lucus looked at the damp cloth on the table beside him, where tiles waited patiently, still quiet, still holding the coolness of their soak. His hand hovered. And then chose. A grey tile. With a hairline crack that looked like a rivet drawn with the tip of a needle. He pressed it gently into the mortar, thumbs at the corners, fingers guiding it from beneath. The mortar lifted slightly at the sides, a quiet rise, like a tide beneath a boat. Lucas brushed away the excess with a finger, then wiped his hand on the edge of his apron. Another stone. A paler one. Square, but uneven. One corner slightly curved, not from error, but from story. He liked that. He set it beside the last, pressing softly. Adjusting the angle by no more than a breath's width. His body leaned in. Not for effort. But for nearness. This work, it asked to be close. He lowered his elbow to rest lightly on the wood. Let his head drift forward. And stayed there. Just breathing. Just feeling. The stones did not demand energy. They asked only for care. And so he gave it. Each stone. Lifted with both hands. Each press. A return to stillness. He aligned them not only by line. But by weight, by silence. Some stones felt too proud, he pressed them further. Some too low, he removed them, smoothed the mortar beneath, and tried again. There was no frustration. Only repetition. He adjusted. He smoothed. He tried again. Not because it had to be perfect. But because it had to be calm. Behind him, a bird chirped from the fig tree outside the window. Once. Then again. Then silence. Lucas didn't look up. He knew that bird. It visited often. Its voice. Familiar as the sound of water from the nearby well. He placed another tile. This one. Black. Polished on one side. Rough on the other. He turned it in his hand. Chose the rough side. Pressed it gently. It sat beautifully. Not standing out, not hiding. Just there. Among others. Lucas stepped back once more. The row now curled slightly, following the early lines of the design he had sketched days before. No image yet. No picture. But the beginning of a curve. Like the first line of a letter on a blank scroll. He walked to the basin, washed his hands in the cool water. The dust fell away in lazy clouds, settling like memories at the bottom. Then he returned. Sat on the stool. And just looked. The stones were in place. The mortar would set soon. But not yet. For now, they rested in stillness, not frozen, but soft. Lucas folded his hands in his lap. Closed his eyes. And in the quiet, he let the day stretch forward. Slowly. Like the light moving across the floor. He had laid the first stones. Tomorrow, perhaps, the pattern would begin to speak. But for now, he had said enough. Lucas rose early. Before the sun. Before the birds. Before even the light knew it was morning. He moved through his home without sound, feet bare against the cold stone floor, hands tracing familiar shapes in the dark. The workshop door creaked. Softly. He did not mind. The creak was old. Predictable. A voice he trusted. He stepped into the room. The mosaic slab waited. Unchanged. But different. The first stones laid yesterday. Now rested firm in their beds of mortar. Dry, but not brittle. Set. But still quiet. Lucas stood above them, not to judge, not to admire, but simply to return. The faint charcoal lines beneath the stones still whispered from the untouched spaces. They curled and curved like vines on ancient pottery, suggesting something, but saying nothing too soon. He lowered himself slowly onto the stool beside the slab. And exhaled. This part of the work was not about placing. It was about listening. The design would not leap from the stone. It would rise. Slowly. Like steam from a warmed floor, like the shadow of a thought before the thought itself. He leaned forward and traced a finger along the empty space where the curve continued, a soft arc drawn long ago on a flat panel of wood. The charcoal was light. Almost vanished. But Lucas remembered it. He remembered drawing it late in the evening, weeks before the first stone was chosen. He'd lit a single oil lamp, slept beside the blank slab, and waited for the image to settle in his mind. Not to arrive. Not to appear. But to settle. Like flour into a bowl of water. Drifting first, then stilling. Now, that arc called to him again. Not loudly. Not urgently. Just. Patiently. He dipped the spatula into fresh mortar, carefully mixed an hour before dawn. It was thicker this morning. The air had dried slightly overnight. He adjusted. Added a few drops of water from the jug near the door. Stirred slowly. Watched the texture shift from grit to cream with each movement of the tool. He did not rush. Once satisfied, he spread a small patch beside the first row. Only a crescent. Just enough to hold 4 or 5 tiles. He turned to the tray of stone pieces. They had been sorted the day before, earthy reds, dusty yellows, deep charcoal grey. From these, he would draw the curve. Lucas lifted a thin red tile, not bright, but weathered, like clay left in the sun. He placed it gently at the beginning of the line. Pressed. Paused. Then reached for a yellow piece, rounded at one end, chipped on the other. Not ideal. But honest. He placed it next, angling it slightly to match the bend of the arc. One by one, he followed the line, choosing not only color, but emotion. This curve was not merely a shape. It was breath. It was motion. It was the echo of something soft and unspoken. Lucas leaned in further, letting his shoulder rest against the edge of the work table, his forearm supporting his weight. The morning sun had begun to slip through the high window, casting a pale light across his workspace. It caught the surface of the tiles with a gentle glint, not bright, but kind. He continued. Gray. Then red. Then 2 soft yellows in a row. Each tile touched the curve without claiming it. He checked spacing. Made sure each gap breathed just enough. Too close, and the line would feel tight. Too wide, and it would lose its shape. Lucas knew this curve was part of something larger, a wave, perhaps, or the beginning of a petal. But he didn't try to see the whole. That would come later. For now, his world existed in these few inches, this single stretch of suggestion. He worked for nearly an hour. Placing stone after stone, each one guided by the faint memory of the line. And when he stopped, he did not step back. He did not rise. He simply lowered his hands into his lap, and stared. The curve now stood half complete. Still quiet. Still almost invisible. But it had shape. It had rhythm. Lucas breathed in slowly. Then out. He let his eyes rest on the shape. Not analyzing, not correcting, just letting it be. The workshop was still. The stones were still. And for a long moment, so was Lucas. Tomorrow, he would continue the curve. Tomorrow, he might glimpse more of the pattern. But today, this quiet shape was enough. Lucas had not moved for some time. Still seated beside the slab, his eyes lingered on the gentle arc he'd begun earlier that morning. The curve, now dotted with soft reds, weathered yellows, and occasional flecks of grey, rested like a thought mid-sentence, not interrupted, but paused. Waiting for the next word to arrive. Lucas leaned slightly to the side, reaching for the linen-covered tray that held another cluster of sorted tesserae. These stones had been hand-cut months ago. filed smooth at the edges, soaked in water, and dried slowly on sun-warmed shelves. They were not sorted by size. Not even strictly by color. But by feeling, by tone. By whether they invited stillness, or resisted it. His fingers moved over them. Not choosing right away. He lingered, brushing the stones with the tips of 2 fingers, as though listening for the next note in a song. There. A soft ochre tile. Square, but not proud. It sat easily in his hand, as if it had always belonged there. He dipped a finger in the mortar, spread a small patch, no wider than a palm, along the unfinished curve. The mixture glistened for a moment before settling, like cream settling into a shallow bowl. Lucas placed the ochre stone. Not pressed hard. Just placed. Gently. Letting it rest. Then, a darker red. Then, 2 pale greys. The rhythm was not predictable. But it was balanced. Not symmetrical, never that. But even. Like footfalls on dry earth. Like the hush between breaths. Lucas stepped back. Not far. Just enough to change the angle of his gaze. From above, the colors began to hum, a quiet vibration, subtle and patient. They were becoming something. Not yet a picture. But more than scattered tiles. He moved again, this time reaching for a tiny tray of broken tesserae, shards left over from earlier designs. These were his favorites. They carried pieces of other stories, a half curve from a border, a chipped corner once part of a fish's fin, a fleck of green from an olive branch laid in someone else's floor long ago. He chose a slender piece, almost triangular, with one smooth side and a ridge on the other. He turned it in his hand. Held it up to the light. It caught the sunlight just for a moment. A glint, a flicker. Then he laid it at the edge of the arc, not to extend the line, but to guide the eye. Like a quiet gesture at the end of a phrase. Lucas exhaled. And then placed another. And another. The color shifted slightly now, from warm earth to cooler ash, from afternoon clay to early evening stone. It was not abrupt. The transition moved slowly, like dusk, like the fading of a long day. The rhythm of shape and color settled into him. His movements became softer, as if the stones themselves were choosing where to go. He stopped thinking. Stopped directing. Just followed. One tile at a time, the curve became a ribbon. The ribbon began to loop, not tightly, but wide and slow. The arc dipped. Then lifted. Then gently coiled, suggesting something floral, or something celestial. He wasn't sure. Lucas didn't need to know yet. Knowing wasn't part of the rhythm. Placing was. Listening was. That was another quiet moment. In the slow, uneventful day of Lucas. The light continues to shift, the patterns slowly take shape, and the hours drift onward, as gently as dust in a sunbeam. If your eyes are still open, we'll ease into the next part. Right after this breath.